Good morning to everyone. Mr. President of the Congress of Guatemala, Álvaro Arzú Escobar, Mrs. Gabriela Lara, and other representatives of the Global Embassy of Activists for Peace, distinguished ambassadors, parliamentarians, politicians, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. In the name of the General Secretary of the OAS, Luis Almagro, it is an honor for me to be present here in this session. I take advantage of this opportunity to extend to Dr. William Soto Santiago a affectionate salutation from the General Secretary. It is also good for me to come back to Guatemala and to have the opportunity to see so many friends, colleagues, and experts, and also first for Latin America and the Caribbean, which I have the pleasure to meet between 2002 and 2005, when I have the honor of performing as the ambassador of Canada in Guatemala. I'd like to take advantage of their deliberations today on diplomatic and political affairs to share with you some reflections on the subject of this session: governance and co-responsibility, the OAS as a factor of continental cohesion. And briefly, to try to identify how the OAS, that is now celebrating its 70th year of existence, is by itself a reflection of the huge diversity that characterizes the region that we inhabit. We only have to see around us this morning to see that the hemisphere is characterized by the tremendous diversity of regions, countries, cultures, languages, systems, and social practices. This is manifested in the distance when we compare regions and countries, but also within each country. In Guatemala and Mexico, where I also served, the number of cultures and indigenous languages is amazing. And the great impact in the configuration of the history and the economic governance and political region that was created from colonial area until the Cold War. Scoping all this diversity, it's important to navigate in between the academic constructions that give order to the universe and to the specific reality that applies to regions so distant, like in the case of Santa Lucia and Santiago in the South Cone. In fact, there are generalities that need to be explored as we address this region, both today and as in its evolution. In fact, the Americas, in spite of the a couple of decades of continued growth, it continues surpassing the world scale in terms of exclusion, social exclusion, and it obligates us to question about in this diversity, what are the common points and what are still continuing these differences. In spite of diversity, there are still a lot of terms. For example, capitalism, clientelism, corruption, chauvinism, which will continue regularly in the majority of countries of our region independently. It doesn't matter if they're public democracies like the Westminster. Besides, it is worth to point out the diversities and the conditions that are manifested. Many the challenges that we are facing are common: migration, matters, globalization, transborder delinquency, climate change, pandemic illnesses, technological information accompanied by laboral displacement, and problems of cybersecurity, just to name some. The OAS, as the principal multilateral organism and institutional in the region, performs a key role in the treatment of these common issues. But to explain it well, I allow myself to put this in a historic perspective. Beyond the 70th year that we celebrate this year, the OAS has its real origin in 1889. So over 120 years, this has been the regional organization of the continuous operation, the oldest one in the world. As it took form, institutional form, the organization started to generate results for the common good. A good example of this is the Inter-American Commission of Women, which was founded 90 years ago in 1928. This organization has a proud tradition of establishing global norms, even in 1933 with the negotiation of the Convention on the Nationality of Women, which stipulated that the nationality should not be affected by marriage. This was the first international instrument legally vinculating, linking to the rights of women. This was the first. The most recent in 1994, the CIM, the Commission of Women, gave origin to the Inter-American Convention to prevent, sanction, and eradicate violence against women. The Convention of Belém do Pará. And during all this period, it has played a role, an important role, to face the challenges that women suffer in the region and to train new generations of political women politician women. In fact, OAS was the place in which the network of treaties and the jurisprudence, international jurisprudence that gave origin to many institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank, the Health and Agricultural Institution, in a century in which Europe, Asia, and Africa were choked by violent confrontations between countries, regions. The Americas, even due to this, they were relatively free from wars between states. Of course, that doesn't mean that the region was free from violence, oppression, or the abuse of human rights, because we had all that at a massive scale. Under the direction of the General Secretary Luis Almagro, from 2015, the OAS has reoriented its efforts to put human rights and democratic values in the center of our activities. Its slogan, more rights for more people, is now the objective that we want to achieve. In some sense, we're trying to go to turn OAS to its original mandate and to be as the hemispheric principal body for the solving of controversies and the promotion of democratic values. I'd like to use the rest of my time to speak about this important objective, which is democracy, as well as the common obstacle, which is corruption. As General Secretary Almagro has mentioned, the rule of law, of the protection of individual people, human rights do not exist in societies where there is no rule of law. And there is no rule of law in societies in which human rights are not protected. At its time, citizens should have complete liberty to participate in the processes of decision making that determine the laws that rule them. Through universal voting, that the citizens have their rights and responsibilities guaranteed in the heart itself of democracy. Inequality is the worst impairment for development, and the worst inequality is the one that results from the lack of protection for the rights of citizens. At the OAS, we have consecrated these values in our foundational documents. The OAS is the first regional organization to state the principle of democracy, representative democracy, as an essential element for development. From the beginning, the OAS has had a undeniable wish to promote and, when necessary, to protect democracy in the region. Of course, in the practice, the politics and diplomacy not always work as we wish, and the states not always comply with their obligations. Many of our member states suffered dictatorships, military dictatorships, which led to the suspension of elections and eliminated the majority of the guarantees of the human rights, basic human rights, or the access to justice. Being aware of the fragility of democracy in 1991, the member states approved the commitment of Santiago to democracy and to human rights, and a little later, the resolution 1080 which requests a specific action from the member states when an abrupt interruption or irregular of the political, institutional, democratic process had taken place in the OEA. That was a very important change.
Although initially conceived as tools to defend against military coups or external forces, it was readily apparent that threats to democracy could also come from within the democratic process itself. So in 2001, member states adopted the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which is now the veritable Constitution of the Americas. The Democratic Charter expanded the authority and responsibility of the OAS to react in situations where there was a deterioration of the internal constitutional stability leading to a threat to democracy. Article 1 of the Democratic Charter enshrines democracy as a right, stating that the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy and their governments have an obligation to promote and defend it. Those elected to lead assume the responsibility to protect these rights, and if they do not, they lose the legitimacy to lead. The Democratic Charter defines the essential elements of representative democracy as a respect for human rights, of fundamental freedoms, rule of law, periodic, free and fair elections based on universal suffrage, a pluralistic system of political parties, as well as the separation of powers and the independence of the branches of government. Democracy was clearly defined, as were the situations where member states might cooperate and support one another. It is designed to reinforce the principle of regional solidarity in the international defense of democracy. Article 20, for example, establishes the authority of any member state or the Secretary General to act and outlines a range of measures for possible recourse, empowering the Permanent Council to take such decisions as it deems appropriate in the face of a breakdown of constitutional regularity in a member state. The obligation to the international defense of democracy is created when individual states signed onto these treaties, codifying these into principles of international law. We have created an international requirement to observe and scrutinize our democracy. Prior to the tragic case that has unfolded in Venezuela, the Democratic Charter has been invoked 7 times and triggered once in the case of a coup d'etat. In diplomacy, these agreements become our tools, and in each of these cases, regional solidarity has been strengthened as member states have worked together to support the state in question on its path back to democracy, and let us hope that will be the case in Venezuela. Finally, let me address the question of corruption. Perhaps the greatest of existential threats comes from within the political system and poses a central challenge to the stability and growth of our region. Corruption and bad practices are contagious. It is a disease that is easily spread and which can create a very dangerous precedent. Corruption not only affects the citizens economically, but undermines the public trust in the governments elected to serve them. Embedded institutional corruption results in the gradual atrophying of democratic norms. Across the Americas, political corruption has mobilized citizens to take to the streets, to demand transparency, to demand accountability. Political campaigns are being fought and won to push out corrupt leaders and challenge entrenched elites who prevent any meaningful change or meaningful reforms. This is a reality in countries as populous as Brazil to the microstates of the Caribbean. Corruption has become front and center on the political stage in Central America and particularly in the Northern Triangle. As we know, there have been several multilateral missions to address these. I was here present at the creation of CICIG in Guatemala under UN direction, and the mission to support and fight against corruption and impunity in Honduras, which falls under the direction of the OAS, is another important example of these initiatives. In Honduras, OAS efforts have helped to establish a special anti-corruption jurisdiction in the judiciary, vetting the judges that oversee corruption cases. Additionally, the mission recruited and vetted specialized team in the public ministry to investigate and prosecute cases related to corruption. The political cost of not fighting corruption for democratic regimes has grown much higher in the era of digital globalization, where a photo posted on Twitter or a leaked document, for instance, rapidly catches fire in a virtual world. There is no surprise to see anti-politics and anti-establishment trends around the world after cases such as Odebrecht, Panama, and Paradise Papers, which have recently come to light. Public scrutiny for government officials is facilitated with ease by social media and a 24-hour news cycle, and therefore much higher than ever before, fighting corruption has become a central challenge to sustain satisfaction and legitimacy of the representative democratic model, and hence the importance of open government, open data, open contracting, and the involvement, the full involvement in civil society in the scrutiny and oversight of governments in our region.
Interesting subject was corruption and its impact in the democratic governance. Layman's agreement of 57 points on corruption issued in this meeting grants the OAS and our brother institutions in the Americas a powerful mandate to continue addressing these terrible practices. The fact that what Peru was facing is this same problem. It continued with the summit. It highlighted the seriousness of its commitment, and it gave us a great example to all of us. At the end of the day, the link between solid institutions and services, public professional services, is the core of our efforts to strengthen democracy and human rights. The OAS is rebuilding its credibility and institutional capacity. It provides a unique place, as seen in the past months, for the member states and experts can address the situation in cases, complicated and controversial cases like the one of Venezuela and Nicaragua. To be effective and truly democratic, the discussion must go beyond the government to involve all the interested actors, as just like you nowadays. Once again, on behalf of the General Secretary Luis Almagro, I thank the Global Embassy of Activists for Peace and the participants gathered in this room for the support we can give each other. Thank you very much.